Welcome everyone to MHPN's August webinar. My name is Xiaohanbao Smith. I am your moderator. Today we will be learning about the Mission 66, modernizing campgrounds while preserving historic heritage. And before I go over to turn it over to our speakers, I would like to go over some Zoom items. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box as you think of them. All the questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. And the chat box will be used to share resources or links discussed during the webinar. Both the chat box and Q&A box are located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you don't see them, please wiggle your mouse and they should pop up. If this is your first time attending our webinar, we are the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. We support the sustainability and economic viability of Michigan's historic places through advocacy, education, and direct action. We cannot do the work we do without our members and volunteers. So if you're not a member yet, please consider joining us at www.mhpn.org. And I have a few announcements. We are calling for abstracts for our May 2026 webinar. Conference in Grosse Pointe Shores, Michigan. And the deadline for submitting your abstract is September 21st, 2025. And we have our 31st annual fall benefit at the 4-Star Theater in Grand Rapids on October 4th. So we will have strolling dinner, complimentary beer and wine, venue tours, auction, awards, and ceremony, and more. And please RSVP by Sunday, September 21st, 2025. There are also a couple of workshops. The Advanced Cemetery Preservation Workshop is scheduled for September 13th, and it will be in Flint. And there's also a hands-on masonry workshop scheduled for October 18th in Grand Rapids. You can register for both workshops on our website. If you're seeking continuing education credits, we are providing AICPC M1 for this webinar, and you will need to log in your credits online after this event. I will drop this link to the chat in a minute. Our webinars are supported in part by an award from the Michigan Arts and Culture Council and the National Endowment for the Arts. We want to say a big thank you to our sponsors. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce you our speakers. We will be hearing from Lauren Strauss, designer at Queen Evans, and we will also be hearing from Patty Babin, co-director of preservation planning at Queen Evans. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to our speakers.
Great. Thank you so much. We're really excited to be here today and really appreciate you offering us and inviting us to present today on our Mission 66 project on campgrounds. Our project was to produce National Register Determination of Eligibility process guidelines for Mission 66 campgrounds. And this project was in partnership with the National Park Service and the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers. So my assumption is that many of you have gone camping and many of you may have camped in national parks. And if that's the case, you may have camped in a Mission 66 campground. Our project began in 2020, and at the time, the National Park Service was anticipating a large amount of funding to address the much needed maintenance for critical facilities and infrastructure, including campgrounds. So the National Park Service developed a National Register multiple property documentation form for Mission 66 resources in 2015. And this document established the significance of Mission 66, the established property types, and provided National Register requirements for listing Mission 66 properties in the National Register. As of 2020, when our project started, a number of the campgrounds had not been evaluated for the National Register. In anticipation of campground projects, our main goal of this project was to create process guidelines to promote a consistent and efficient structured approach to evaluating Mission 66 campgrounds for the National Register and preparing consensus DOEs across state historic preservation offices. So here are the 4 learning objectives for today's presentation. We're going to summarize the history of camping in the National Park Service, explore how the Mission 66 program initiatives changed and created those campgrounds that you see today, discuss challenges and future of the Mission 66 campgrounds, and talk about our products that we produced as part of this project. So to understand the magnitude of Mission 66, we must first start with the National Park Service history. The National Park Service was established in 1916, although the first national park was Yellowstone in 1872. When the National Park Service was established in 1916, there were 35 parks and monuments, and by 1933, this number had grown to 56. Between the years of 1933 and 1966, the park system was rapidly expanding, and a large effort of the development in the 1930s was completed by the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC. The CCC built many of the rustic campgrounds and park infrastructure that we see in National Park Service parks today, and it provided jobs to millions of young men during the Great Depression. So we see their legacy in roads, trails, picnic areas, and cabin camps, and we still see these features in national parks today. During this period of growth between the 1930s and the 1960s, the National Park Service conducted studies to understand the growth and patterns of the park system. One of these studies was completed in 1941, and it was a report on the study of park and recreation problem in the United States. This graphic is one that was produced as part of the report, and it illustrates how far travelers had to drive to visit a park, the ratio of travelers to cars, and how much time was spent on day visits versus long vacations and other factors. It's important to note that camping culture in the United States was quite different than what the average camper experiences today. Historically, camping was very rustic and primitive with minimal supplies and camping facilities and established campgrounds. This later evolved to be an activity that was serviced by concessionaires who would set up everything you needed for camping. This was a finer side of camping with elegant dress code, large spacious tents, and established gathering and eating areas. As camping grew more popular with the rise of the automobile in the 20th century, it became clear that the existing campgrounds were overcrowded, they lacked amenities, and there weren't enough facilities for the demand. As you can see in these 2 historic images, both campgrounds are centered around the car, and there are some large open spaces, not really designated areas, and you can see overcrowding conditions. After World War II, the National Park Service once again experienced a tremendous increase in visitors. And in 1945, the National Park Service saw 11 million visitors. By 1954, that number had increased to almost 48 million. There are a lot of different reasons that caused this, including the creation of the interstate system that connected more people across the country, growing families, and the popularity of road trip vacations. Mission 66 was the direct answer to the problem of facing the National Park Service with overcrowded facilities and crumbling infrastructure. This Mission 66, Our Heritage, which was completed in 1956, was a guidebook for Mission 66 and the National Park Service. So Mission 66 was a program that was intended to last 10 years from 1956 to 1966, ending at the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the National Park Service. In total, the National Park Service spent over $1 billion and was the largest construction program to upgrade parks in the agency's history. Under this program, 70 new units were authorized, hundreds of park residences, comfort stations, and other public use properties were built. Over 100 new visitor centers were constructed during this time, and over 17,000 campsites were added to the park system. So now I'm going to turn it over to Lauren, who's going to talk a little bit about Mission 66 characteristics and some of the park campgrounds that we took a look at during this project.
Thanks, Patty. A couple characteristics architecturally for Mission 66. So this was when the Mission 66 program broke from the typical parkitecture style of campground buildings. You can think of like Yellowstone Lodge, Timberline in Oregon, those type of big masonry and wood timber buildings. What they wanted to do was they integrated elements of mid-century architecture using new materials such as steel, concrete, and prefabricated materials. The goal was always that parks were for the people, and they developed areas that were located to provide easy access for visitors by car, while still focusing on those naturalistic settings. So these two images is Shark Valley Observation Tower in the Everglades and Jackson Lake Lodge in Grand Teton National Park. Another influential outcome of the Mission 66 program was the new typology of the visitor center. The visitor center was this building that was supposed to house many different functions, including a museum space, a gift shop, restrooms, as well as an auditorium. They emphasize gathering, programming, and interpretation for the parks. This is the visitor center at the Wright Brothers National Memorial. And here's an inside shot showing that gallery and that museum space. And then this is the original rendering showing what these designers proposed that this new building would look like. Campground characteristics was also an important study for the Mission 66 program. What they wanted to do was set out a standard for campground layouts. And so they really created this idea of loop campground layouts, which is very typical of what we still see today and implemented in our modern campgrounds. Beyond the loop layout for the campsites, they also had different types of campsite parking, including loops, spurs, arcs, and different ways for cars to interact with the campsites that they were at. The next part of our project was doing field survey process. In total, we visited 8 potential eligible Mission 66 campgrounds from the West Coast to the East Coast, including ones at Olympic National Park, Lee's Ferry, Big Bend National Park, Blue Ridge Parkway, and Peaks of Otter. During this survey, our team utilized photography, GIS maps, inventory forms, and sketches to complete our fieldwork. We evaluated buildings, structures, small-scale features, landscapes, and circulation patterns. The first one I'm going to talk about is located at Great Smoky Mountains National Park. We actually surveyed 3 campgrounds that were potentially eligible in this park. The interesting thing about Great Smoky Mountains is it is between 2 different states, Tennessee and North Carolina. It's also one of the most visited national parks and the most biologically diverse. There's a lot of history in this park, and it includes both CCC era structures as well as Mission 66. The 3 campgrounds we surveyed was Cades Cove, Elkmont, and Deep Creek. I'm going to focus on Elkmont Campground. So Elkmont is located at the north of the park. It's one of the largest campgrounds in the park with 73 acres, 19 buildings, 200 campsites, and 4 group campsites. A fun fact about Elkmont, it's also the location of a firefly migration in the early summer. So if you haven't been yet, you should definitely plan to go at that time of the year. Elkmont was built between 1958 and 1965 to replace an earlier temporary campground. It quickly became an ideal place to explore with the surrounding natural and cultural history. On the left, you can see the registration station during a busy fall weekend. And then on the right is the historic layout using the topography and the natural features of the site. So Elkmont is located around the Little River, and the layout of the site is in these loop layouts directly correlated to how the river flows through the campground. They wanted to use the natural topography, the creeks, and they wanted to be able to lay out the cabins and the different campsites along that area. There was some restrictions due to the site potentially flooding, and the majority of the loops were built in that flat floodplain along the river. In total, there are 12 comfort stations at Elkmont, and these were built between 1960 and 1963. In Mission 66, for comfort stations, they utilize standardized plans, and they all have similar features. These are very mid-century modern style with low horizontal profiles that have ribbon windows and gabled roofs with those extended prow eaves that you can see. Usually there's also some type of privacy wall shielding the two entrances, as well as a dishwashing sink in the middle. On the left, you can see right after construction what those comfort stations look like. And then on the bottom left is what we surveyed in 2021. Amphitheater was also a major programming element to Mission 66. Gathering and interpretation were these new ideas that they wanted to implement in their campgrounds. The Elkmont Amphitheater that you can see on the right was built in 1964. It has a very dramatic design featuring a small stage building with a distinct prow shape similar to the comfort stations and large metal trusses. The photo on the bottom right is how it looks today. It is still in great shape and implemented into the programming that they're using right now. Oops. So a couple more historic photos. Before they would build a ranger station, sometimes they would just have these ranger station kiosks and where you would find your campsite and you would pay right there. The upper right is also showing what they would have for a typical campground layout. And then the bottom photos are showing what we saw in 2021. So some of the campgrounds in that flat floodplain area had multiple campsites that were close together with not a lot of vegetation separating. And then the right also shows that idea of the spur campground where you would park and you would be right next to everything you needed. Our findings, we found that Elkmont's determination of eligibility was eligible. It was eligible under local significance and the National Register criteria A and C. Out of the 19 buildings and structures that were found on site, 14 were contributing, while the other were non-contributing. They had a number of character-defining features that added to their design. It has a loop arrangement that you can see here, with spurs and parallel parking for the campsites. It incorporated natural features and native vegetation, as well as the campground design works seamlessly with the native topography and utilized the site. And there was also multiple sites that had those distinct river views. One of the next campgrounds that we looked at was in Olympic National Park, and it's the Fairholme Campground. So Fairholme Campground is located at the northern end of Olympic National Park along the western edge of Lake Crescent. Lake Crescent is a glacial lake surrounded by mountain ranges, including the Pyramid Mountains and Mount Storm King. This lake has always had a history of tourism where there were multiple resorts and ferries and boating all occurring before the campground was there. There are 90 individual campsites, 3 comfort stations, a well house, a small shed, and what remains of the amphitheater. Fairholme followed the similar characteristics of other Mission 66 campgrounds, utilizing 3 loop designs that were all connected by these smaller pedestrian paths. The major important feature at Fairholme was the connection to Lake Crescent, so this one also included a boat launch and an amphitheater area for programming. Fairholme has 3 comfort stations. What is different, and these ones were built in 1963. Similar to Elkmont, they followed a standardized type of layout, but what was different here was they utilized different types of materials due to the climate conditions environment of the Pacific Northwest. So here are some photos from when the comfort stations were first built on the left, and then what we saw in 2021. So you can see how they did change a couple things. Originally, the comfort stations had cedar shingle roofs, and they found that with maintenance and over time that this was really hard to keep in repair. And so they changed them to standing seam roofs. They also have that distinct prow shape on their overhangs of their roof, as well as those ribbon windows. These ones are also different because instead of CMU that you saw at Alkmaar, they utilize board and batten siding. The amphitheater Alkmaar, or at Fairholme, was designed with a fire circle, slope seating, and a wooden stage and platform. It is different than the amphitheater at Alkmaar, and it was meant to be more incorporated and integrated into the forest, as well as having those walking paths connecting it to Lake Crescent. Here is what we saw in 2021. Unfortunately, due to that very wet Pacific Northwest climate, these materials that they used at Fairholme did not age as well. You can see here on the photos on the left, the timber seating and things like that have all deteriorated, as well as that wood stage that they used. Our findings for Fairholme was that it was also eligible. Fairholme, while smaller than Alkmaar, still had a number of character-defining features. It still contained its 3 loops with spurs and parallel parking, natural features, and native vegetation. The campground design was integrated into the natural topography, including the access from Highway 101, as well as being situated on Lake Crescent. One of our last campgrounds we looked at was Glen Canyon National Recreation Area and Lee's Ferry Campground. So Glen Canyon is located along the Colorado River within this Glen Canyon National Recreation Area outside of Page, Arizona. The surrounding desert landscape has the Vermilion Cliffs, the Paria Canyon, and the Colorado River, and the Echo Cliffs. It's a very different landscape than what we had seen in the other 2. The campground has 54 individual campsites, 2 comfort stations, a ranger station, a water tower, and what remains of the amphitheater. What's interesting to note, and you can see in this photo, the upper right is showing the development of the campground, and there's 2 flat plateaus where they were going to have 3 more loops, but they were never constructed. These 2 historic images show how the aerial view of the development of the campground. Like I mentioned before, you can see on the upper or on the left-hand side, the half of the campground has been developed, while the 2 flat plateaus you can see are never constructed. The photo on the right is showing how busy the ranger station could be during a busy river weekend. The ranger station and the water tower were both built in 1964, and they're located north of the campground. Originally, this building was 2 bays wide with a carport at the north side of the building. In 1992, that original carport was enclosed to create additional office space, and a new carport was erected. What's interesting about Lee's Ferry is all the buildings and the water tower are both painted pink to match and blend into the landscape. Interpretation and gathering areas were key design elements to Mission 66 campgrounds. The photo on the upper right is showing a ranger leading an interpretive talk for visitors, while sadly the photo on the bottom right is what remains of the amphitheater today. Here are a couple more photos from 2021 when we were on site. As I mentioned before, what is unique about Lee's Ferry is that everything, including their shade structures, their comfort stations, were all painted pink so that they can match into the surrounding landscape. Shade is also a very key element here as you are in a hot, arid landscape, and there isn't a lot of vegetation. What also we found was that there were a lot more expanded sites at Lee's Ferry, including pull-in sites to accommodate larger RVs that it was never originally planned for. The comfort stations, there are 2 of them, were built between 1964 and 1968. They have those similar standardized plans with ribbon windows, low profile roofs with that distinct prow shape. While we were on site, we utilized sketches and other means of taking notes. And here are some of those notes from that site survey, including measurements, as well as the typical layout for those campsites. So unlike the other 2 campgrounds, we did find that Lee's Ferry was non-eligible. And there is a couple of reasons why. We noted that a lot of the items were changed or modified. Parking campsites had been increased in size, signage had been replaced, the ranger station had been extended, and it was also unused by the public anymore. And then we also saw that the amphitheater was unused and had deteriorated. Other evaluation items that we had was that the campground was never fully built as it was intended. 3 of the loops had never been constructed, and so the design intent we felt was not there. It also didn't have the range of contributing buildings and structures that we typically saw in other Mission 66 campgrounds, and the use of vegetation, topography, and natural features to create privacy was not present. Patty, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thanks, Lauren. So as I mentioned, the goal of this project was to produce documents and tools for the National Park Service managers and others to evaluate and determine if the campgrounds are eligible for listing in the National Register in anticipation of improvements, rehabilitation to those campgrounds, knowing that there would be, Section 106 compliance and other requirements prior to and during planning for those types of projects. So we produced a range of materials, but the 3 primary were determination of eligibility guidelines, treatment guidelines for Mission 66 campgrounds, and a determination of eligibility form. So the process guidelines were designed to help park managers and others look at the qualifications and how to research what were the typical features of a Mission 66 campground and how to use that multiple property documentation form to determine if the campground is eligible for listing in the National Register. So as part of this, we worked with the National Park Service to create graphics and text to help walk through this process. So this is just an example of illustration on how you would complete the field survey, then the evaluation, and then work with your state historic preservation officer or office to get concurrence on your determination of eligibility. And then ideally, then if you do have an eligible campground, you might be able to move into an actual listing in the National Register. We also created some graphics to understand the typical characteristics of a campground's Mission 66 campgrounds. And one of the things we determined was, a lot of projects might only include a comfort station or a small amount of the campground. But for a determination of eligibility, you really need to look at the whole campground because that is the resource. So this is an example on the left of typical features of a campground. And then we recognized that a lot of campgrounds were part of a larger development area that had other features, such as a lodge, ranger stations, visitor center. And so you might need to think about your campground eligibility in terms of a larger development. We had a cultural landscape approach to looking at the campgrounds. There are lots of characteristics of the campgrounds that are landscape specific. And so this diagram is to help with looking at integrity and what features are important for a campground and really kind of walking you through questions to help you determine if a campground has sufficient integrity for listing in the National Register. One thing we worked closely with the National Park Service and NICSHPO on is this DOE template. A lot of state SHPOs have determination of eligibility forms or requirements for listing or doing that consensus DOE. But we wanted to, if possible, create something that could be used as a standardized form that had a lot of built-in information for a park manager or others to kind of quickly get through and standardize that process. So we did use and create a DOE template for many of the determinations of eligibility that we did for this project. For those states that had a required form, we could use still the data and the basic information that's provided in the template and just kind of transfer it to their requirements and their templates that are needed. So one of the last pieces was treatment guidelines. The National Park Service was creating design guidelines for campgrounds in anticipation of campground projects, but our treatment guidelines really focus on historic campgrounds and how you can be sensitive to their character-defining features, important features, and meet the Secretary of Interior standards. So this is just an example of our project layout. And looking at how we divided the treatment guidelines into a little history of the campgrounds, how to scope a project for compliance, and then the actual guidelines for campgrounds. This example is showing amphitheaters and defining those particular characteristics and then providing specific treatment options or treatment recommendations for amphitheaters. And one other thing that the treatment guidelines address is accessibility. A lot of the comfort stations in particular weren't designed to be accessible. So this particular piece of the guidelines offers some ideas and thoughts on how you can sensitively adapt the comfort stations to be accessible. I think that's the end of our presentation, and we are going to welcome some comments.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Lauren and Patty. I am going to send those links to the guidelines in the chat real quick here. Would you just talk a little bit more about what people can download from those links and the resources in there?
Yes, the links provided, there are two links. One is to the I believe it's to the treatment guidelines. So you can download a PDF of that from the National Park Service data store. And then the other link is the process guidelines, the template, and some of the survey forms that we created as part of that particular piece.
Okay, and we do have quite a few questions in the Q&A, and let's go ahead and start on that. First question, how did you select which parks to survey?
Yes, that was done with help from the National Park Service. I believe they might have reached out to parks and, got a list of which parks had Mission 66 campgrounds that were unevaluated. And then I believe they were looking at examples that were a range of types. So as Lauren mentioned, it's nice to have an example on the West Coast because the architecture might be slightly different. Same thing with the Southwest. And then we had a couple examples on the East Coast. And really it was just to kind of give a range of different types of campgrounds and how those respond to the location of the park.
Okay, next question. What are some of the means to be used to tell the public about this research, the importance of these buildings, and what's being done to conserve them?
That is a great question. I know there has been a lot of Mission 66 interest and books and other scholars who have written about Mission 66 and websites out there about Mission 66. But related to our project in particular, the websites that were shown are pretty much the ways that I know that that particular project is being shared.
Okay, thank you. Next question. If there is a new visitor interest being spurred in these historically important sites, will the demand be met? Oh, sorry, that's maybe that's a different question. Okay, here's a question. Why not national significance since the campgrounds were a part of a coordinated effort across the nation?
If I'm remembering, that's a really great question. If I'm remembering correctly, like while Mission 66 is a national program, it's really applied locally. So each of the parks is unique based on where it's located. As I mentioned, the architecture kind of shifts. The location is very based on the site that it's on, what historic features are there. So while it is a national program, the individual sites are more locally or state significant than they are nationally significant. I believe that more national significance would be if it's a prototype, something really important that would be more of on a national level than these individual particular sites.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Were there specific design features built in to separate or mask the cars from the individual campsites?
Lauren, do you want to speak to that? I'm sure you saw some things on I can take that too.
Yeah. So what we were looking for and what a lot of the designs were, and let me scroll back up so that you can see some of these historic plans. I apologize, I'm going to flip through. What a lot of the historic layouts and drawings was the spur system themselves was meant so that, you know, you would park and then your campground, I think this is a good one to show. You would park, and so you would be parking at an angle that your campground was meant to also be at an angle so that it's not in the direct line of sight. I know that at Elkmont, that was hard to do with that flat floodplain area. And what they really emphasized and what we were looking for was having buffers either with vegetation or with boulders or other small scale features between the sites. And that is what we found at Lee's Ferry with such a dry climate and such a dry, what vegetation had originally been planted might have died or was no longer around. They had implemented those shade structures to try to provide that privacy. So the historic photo that Patty showed where all the campsites and all those cars are around, that was what, you know, they were trying to avoid. But with the loop layouts and with the vegetation, that was the intent there. And while it's not perfect, it was still a lot better than what they had pre-Mission 66. Patty, did you have anything to add to that?
No, that was great, Lauren. I think, yeah, using vegetation and natural features is really the way that they would separate and kind of create more privacy.
And I think an important thing to think about is when these were built, camping had changed a lot even since the 50, 60 years since this time period. You can think of camping now, the size of campers, those kind of things. So you have to keep that in mind as what the original design intent might not be what you're experiencing today at campgrounds.
Hey, thank you. Next question from Tyler. Tyler said, great presentation. And so this is my first dive into Mission 66 campgrounds, and I thought it was interesting. The question is, oh, there are actually a few questions. Did you identify anything specific to the individual campsites themselves? And the second question is, did the individual campsites have a general amenity supplied with a picnic table, fire pit, or barbecue grill? Did the individual campsites have a specific layout that they allowed that played into the overall campground?
Yeah, Patty, I'll take this one as well. I apologize. I flipped to the slide that we had gone over campground characteristics. One thing to also note when they were studying this, and this is also available if you do some Googling, you know, it's a Park Service document from 1959. Camp types was also important to them. So beyond campground layouts and campsite parking, camping types was this idea of what amenities each campground would have or campsite would have. So that was a picnic table, a fire ring, as well as where the car would be and signage, the actual post for noting what the campsite was. And so you can see on that first slide there, there was like the standard, which is kind of the typical we're thinking of. You pull in, you have a picnic table, a barbecue, a fire ring, something like that. And then there was something a little bit more primitive and a little bit more rustic. So the idea that they had these different types. What we found was that some of the historic fire rings were still at the campgrounds, especially those in Great Smoky Mountains. The fire rings have sometimes been replaced as, you know, they have deteriorated and as have campers' needs have increased. But what the typical fire ring was a stone fire ring with a grate. And so some of the campgrounds that we went to still had those there, which was great.
Hey, thank you. Next question. Because many of these historic properties were anchored by lakes, rivers, or streams, will design alterations be needed to avoid climate change-driven flooding dangers?
I don't know if we have a direct answer to that, but I would assume that that is an important part of the project planning process, because you're right. Even some of the ones, particularly at Great Smokies, were planned along rivers and water features and things like that. But I do not believe we specifically introduced that particular types of recommendations.
Thank you. Next question. Are there some Mission 66 campgrounds in Michigan?
Lauren, do you know?
It's kind of hard because I do feel that there's another question I was smiling at where did you turn into avid campers as you were doing this project? And I am laughing because I think the reason I was put on this project at my firm at least was that they knew I liked camping so much, because it was a lot of going out to different places. So now as I am going out, I can recognize a Mission 66 campground. In Michigan, I will have to double check because there are definitely also beyond campgrounds, there are, you know, national lake shores. There are other things that were all part of the Mission 66 program that might not have a campground there. And like Patty was saying, they might be part of a bigger park or a bigger area. I'll have to get back to you on that because I can't, off the top of my head, I'm unsure, but I do know I'm thinking of campgrounds that have implemented ideas that I think were brought into Mission 66. Sleeping Bear has amphitheaters and things like that. And I know that those type of programming elements were very much a Mission 66 type of program.
Okay, I see a comment from Brian Lajeski from SHPO, and he said there are Mission 66 resources on Isle Royal, but not specifically a campground.
Oh, that's great to know.
Okay, next question from Anne. How does the visitorship compare today versus the big mid-century camping boom?
That is a good question that I don't have an exact answer for. Lauren, did you come across that at all? I'm assuming it's the same, if not more, but
yeah. I know that there was a bigger boom, you know, 4 or 5 years ago. I know that was a big increase in tourism and visitation. I'm not sure if I have all the numbers right now, but I did love to research just that time period before World War II and then after, just to see how drastically those numbers increased. And I thought that was really fascinating as well.
Hey, thank you. Next question. Was any archaeology done as part of the survey of the selected campsites?
that is a great question. And we did not survey for archaeology. And there are some guidelines in the process guidelines about archaeology, because while Mission 66, if I'm remembering correctly, so please excuse me, was not necessarily, you're not going to necessarily find at this point archaeology related to Mission 66. I don't think the multiple property documentation form addresses archaeology. However, there could be archaeology at your site for other for other periods of time and themes. So it does mention that, you can't just not do archaeology if you have a project. So there is some guidance in the process guidelines about that.
Okay, thank you. Next question. For any needed restoration of these properties, will there be any problem sourcing replacement materials? For example, repair rather than replace, if replacing, replace in kind.
I don't know, Lauren, if there'd be any problem sourcing materials. A lot of the materials is CMU, right? So it's not necessarily, I think maybe some of the materials or challenges is what Lauren showed in Olympic, where the original material isn't necessarily something they want to replace it with because of the climate or the conditions. And we have seen that in several parks related to the cedar shake grooves. And I know of a particular park in Virginia in particular that source a material that looks like cedar, but it's not cedar because of that challenge with cedar shake roofs.
And one thing I did want to note was some of these changes happen before this project. And so the idea is that we're providing these guidelines so that if a change needs to happen, they would have the tools that they needed to study their campground, as well as some of the design. And Glen Canyon and Lee's Ferry was an interesting one because when I looked inside the bathroom, some of the windows had been painted because of how that campground is laid out and how it's so open that the light shining from the bathroom at night was shining into campsites. And so people had tried to block some of that light out for, their own comfort. So I thought that was an interesting one.
Thank you. Next question from Tyler. So you might have already addressed this in your presentation, but were most of the roads in those campgrounds unpaved?
I think it was a little bit of mix of both. We have a lot of records, talking about the grading work and the paving work and things like that. As I am flipping through this, it seemed like most of the main roads were paved. Even some of the amphitheaters underneath the seats were paved, and things like that. So kind of yes and no. I think now they mostly are all paved. I don't think I witnessed any real off-roading campgrounds, but they do have a lot of grading and topography and things that they did as part of this process. So it was a big endeavor to get these campgrounds in there.
Okay, thank you. Next question. You might also have talked about it in your presentation. So it says that MPS has done such a good job of making their facilities and sites accessible to the handicapped. When did that start?
I do not know the answer to that. I do know that I've been to several campgrounds in the National Park Service that have accessible, like a specific campsite that's designed for accessibility as well as comfort stations. And I know that that work was likely done at least 10 years ago, but I don't have an exact date. I don't know if Lauren, you have anything that you've known just from project work.
I don't. And a lot of the project work is in the 60s time period. I apologize. I'm going to try and skip to that section that we talk about it. What I think was interesting is in the guidelines, we touch on being able to change something from the 60s when it wasn't accessible and what would be an appropriate move versus a not recommended move. Also thinking of the idea of modern camping needs, a lot of showers, things like that, that weren't necessarily part of these standardized camp comfort stations back then, but modern campgrounds and modern campers desire some of these newer amenities. And so that was another thing that was looked at to say, how can we address these kind of updates?
Okay, thank you. I think that we have one more question. Um, so was the Mission 66 design philosophy influenced at all by the fresh air movement designs at the late 19th and early 20th century?
I don't know the answer to that question. Lauren, did you come across anything in your work on that?
I didn't, I just know that the big thing was that it was an experimentation in these newer modern materials such as concrete, preform fabrication, things like that. It also was the idea that they were trying to get away from what architecture was, and good and bad, successful, not successful. It's really interesting to see kind of how that worked. I will say a lot of the campgrounds we looked at did still utilize what materials would be compatible to their site. So you see a lot of stone and wood, and you see other materials used at Olympic versus used at Lee's Ferry and Glen Canyon, stuff like that. But it's a good question. I'll have to look into it.
Okay, great. I think we have answered all the questions, but if you come up with anything else, please let us know afterwards. And thank you, Patty and Lauren, for your presentation. This is great. And just a reminder to everybody, please participate in the survey after we close down the webinar. And this webinar is being recorded. You will receive the recording in the next few days. You will receive an email with a link to the recording, and please feel free to share with anybody that you think would be benefit from it. And I just want to quickly announce our next webinar. Our next webinar is scheduled for September 18th at 1 p.m. and it is about restoration of this building. Now it's African American Cultural and Historical Museum of Washtenaw County. And I hope to see you all next time. Thank you to our speakers again, and hope you all have a great rest of your day.